So I'll come back soon again with the screen on all the participants, but I mean, this is the third seminar in a series of seminars organized by the anti-racist working group of the IMISCO. We started in the summer last year in the shadow of Black Lives Matters manifestations in the United States and in Europe and across the globe. And we decided to bring in research on racism, research on anti-racism more thoroughly within the borders of the IMISCO network. And one of those tasks we took upon ourselves was this about talking about how racism and anti-racism... Sorry? How racism, anti-racism, concepts like race, racialization, ethnicity is talked about in different parts of Europe. And today we have the pleasure of presenting Marta Arracho, sorry for my pronunciation, and Xenia Hellgren to talk about Portugal and Spain. Marta is a senior researcher at the Center for Social Studies of the University of Coimbra, very much famous for one of the nodes in Europe on some of the issues that the series is about, where she integrates the research group Democracy, Citizenship and Law. Marta is currently in the editorial board of Publications of Sociology, Race and Education in Brazil, Britain, Portugal and United States. She obtained her PhD from the University of London in 2003 with a thesis on sociology of race and education on the racialized impact of public policy, focusing on how New Labour's political initiatives in the late 90s perpetuated racial inequality in education. Her research addressed the reproduction and challenging of Eurocentrism and racism in two complementary lines: knowledge, history, and public debates on the one hand, public policy, racial inequality, and collective struggles with a particular interest on education. Some of her recent co-written publication includes, and I'll take the English translation, The Power of Racism in Academia, Production of Knowledge and Political Disputes in Portuguese, and then the Countering Islamophobia in Portugal. So that's Marta, and she will talk about Portugal in 3 minutes from now. But before that, I'll also present Xenia. Xenia is a political sociology from Stockholm University, where she obtained her PhD in 2012. Since 2016, she is a migration diversity scholar at Britain UPF at Barcelona, currently a principal investigator of the AGRA project, Action Program for Effective Reporting of Anti-Gypsyism and Discrimination. In recent years, she's led several European Union-funded research projects on Roma inclusion and on the institutional representation of diversity. She has also worked extensively on migrant domestic work. Xenia's main research area involves inclusion and exclusion, precarity, intersectionality, and agencies of immigrants and racialized groups in European societies, with a particular focus on discrimination. Her research generally integrates a political theory and sociological approaches within the overall framework of citizenship and inclusion. She has worked in numerous international journals and edited volumes. Most recently, for instance, The Dual Expectations Gap, Divergent Perspectives on the Educational Aspirations of Spanish Roma Families, and then Class, Race, and Place, Immigrants' Self-Perceptions on Inclusion, belonging, and opportunities in Stockholm and Barcelona. So very welcome, Marta and Sinja. Now I stop sharing and we are back. My name is Anders Nergård. I'm a member of the anti-racist working group of IMISCO. Normally, I'm a researcher at the Institute of Research on Ethnicity, Migration and Society at Linköping University in Sweden. And you're all welcome to this seminar. And I've already sent out some questions to Marta and to Sinja. And we start with Portugal. My first question then is, what are the main historical elements underpinning race and racism in the debate on Portugal? Please go ahead and welcome.
Okay, thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation to be here. It's really a pleasure. So I think I would start to say that it's quite difficult to discuss racism in Portugal, as I think in most European countries. Of course, there are some kind of variations nationally, but we all have our specific histories that led to this discussion being quite so difficult. So I'll start by situating the concept, which I think is necessary to start to debate and how we are approaching racism. And I situate racism as a historical and political process. So a system that is a threefold system, let's say, of representation, classification, and hierarchization, which emerged in the early modernity. And so I follow here a lot of the writings in the 21st century on post-colonial studies, but also decolonial thought from the mid-20th century onwards. So from this approach, I see racism as being tied to the historical emergence of the notion of Europe. So the notion of Europe came to replace the older notion of Christendom. And this is important to understand the kind of fluidity and complexity of racism that we see throughout time. And all of these discussions about biological scientific racism versus cultural new racism are, in my way, a very skewed way of approaching this, because, of course, racism has always been complex and fluid. So when we look at Middle-Age Iberian Peninsula, we can see that ideas about the racial, what can be described as proto-racial thinking, were already being rehearsed, and this is evident in notions of purity of blood. I don't know if Sen is going to address it, but the kind of difference that was inscribed in the body and passed through blood, and this is evident in the case of new Christians, so converted Jews. They could convert, but there was something essentially different still about them that will be passed in the next generation. So with the expulsion then, in the end of the 15th century, the expulsion of Moorish people from Al-Andalus and the beginning of the Age of Conquest, especially of the Americas in that time, the modern notion of Europe came to be consolidated. And so what we see is the emergence of a template of civilization, which continues to be today at the core of racial distinction. So, and this is evident from history curricula, provisions in health, or even stop and search police practices. So these kind of notions about what is Europe and who is the other are still being reworked. So a second issue is that because of this kind of context in which racism emerges, the long colonial project of the Portuguese, which spans from the 15th to the 20th century, is at the heart of discussions of race and racism, of course. So we should note that it was only in the early 60s that the country formally abolished both the indentured labor practice and enshrined legally, actually, and the Code of the Indigenous People, which ascribed different rights to people on the grounds of race. So this was about 61, so it was not that long ago. Also, the wars waged against the African national liberation movements, they took place from 1961 to 1964, more or less. And so it means that they ended less than 50 years ago, and they are quite alive in the kind of collective memory of the Portuguese and in debates. I mean, last month we had a massive debate around, you know, who are the heroes of this unjust colonial war. So these are issues that are still very much alive, that they make the issue to be quite difficult to be discussed. And so what we see is that whilst racism is nowadays much more subtly enshrined in the law, it's still very strongly institutionalized. And the third element I would like to, sorry, can I? I'll be
course.
short. A third element that I see that we need to consider whilst debating the historical issues underpinning race and racism are the national narratives about the tolerant character of the Portuguese people and about benevolent colonialism that have circulated. I mean, of course, initially the 19th century more related to ideas about a national specificity, then through the discursive field of Luso-Tropicalism that I don't think I have time to explain now, but it's this idea that the Portuguese, because of their historical experience throughout the centuries, were more equipped to deal with the people from the tropics. And this was an idea and a discursive field that influenced the politics of dictator Salazar in the 50s. And so it was also consolidated, this idea, in the politics of comparison of European empires. So the Portuguese were always depicting themselves in comparison to, I don't know, British or Dutch empires, always saying that, you know, we were more benevolent, we were less racist or not racist. And so these are ideas and imaginaries that reverberate today, and I think we'll discuss that. And finally, the systematic critique in the social sciences about the discursive field of Luso-Tropicalism, actually in a very systematic fashion, is quite recent. So it's like in the last 25 years that we saw a more concerted effort in the social sciences, from history to anthropology and sociology, to consolidate the critique to this Luso-Tropicalism, which has made it difficult to discuss race and racism.
Okay, thank you, Marta. Spain is bordering to Portugal or surrounding Portugal. Is there similarities or differences in how the historical elements of race and racism has been discussed in Spain?
Yes, Spain obviously shares part of the colonial history with Portugal, La Conquista. I would say that the impact of colonialism on racial hierarchies, on racism in Spain is indeed similar to what Marta described here in the case of Portugal, and also, for instance, in the historical events now, the Moorish rule in southern Spain, and how that still resonates now in the certain fear, Islamophobic stigmatization of more recently arrived Moroccan migrants, for instance. So indeed, also colonialism has impacted strongly on racial hierarchies in Latin America, which also are now tangible in how different Latin American migrants are treated in Spain, for instance. I have seen this myself in several research projects, and it has been written about this also, for instance, by Teun van Dijk and Edward Telles, on how this denominated pigmentocracies, which in a Latin American context frames the more indigenous look, specifically often Bolivian, Ecuadorian migrants who have these more Indian features are treated worse in a Spanish context. And that is very tangible also when you do research on experiences of discrimination in Spain. So these the colonial racial hierarchies are very much still present now in racialization in the Spanish context, affecting, for instance, then Northern African and Latin American migrants. Then I also believe that in order to talk about racism in the Spanish context, it's absolutely necessary to look at the treatment of the Roma population for the nearly 600 years that they have been present in Spain, and throughout the centuries, how they have been persecuted, marginalized, and confined to only specific professional sectors now, as for instance, ambulating sales and working as blacksmiths or with horse sales and so on, and how that that segregation in specific sectors has also generated a socioeconomic marginalization that is very much still existent in Spanish society. Roma people are overrepresented in situations of poverty and precariousness. They are also more affected by prejudice, according to several studies, than any other ethnic group. For instance, if you ask people, Spanish people, which groups they wouldn't want as neighbors, etc., the rejection of Roma people is generally the most salient one. And also looking at other measures of inequality, as school failure, Roma children double the rate of immigrant children, for instance, in a number of children who do not complete compulsory school. So the situation is very alarming, and there is widespread anti-Gypsyism, which is then related to this historical marginalization. So yeah, that would be summarizing quite briefly now how these historical processes still resonate in the marginalization of different racialized minorities in Spain. You're silent, I think.
Yes, thank you, Senja. I was saying, if we continue a little bit on this topic, how close are the debates in Portugal and Spain? Are they same theoretical influences? Are they coming from different places? I mean, you share to a certain extent this colonial endeavor, but there are a number of specificities connected to Portuguese history, to Spanish history. And then a second question, especially for Senja, to what extent can we talk about Spain with a state that, but a population that many ways refers to Spain as a state and not as a nation with different nationalities in Spain? So Marta and Senja, you can go ahead as you like.
Shall I go first? I would like to pick up on Xenia's the issues that Xenia brought because of the question of the Roma, of course. And Portugal is also a very telling example because you have legislation since the 16th century persecuting the Roma population up until the end of the 20th century, actually. So this is a cause of concern, and we'll go back to the thing. The Roma in Portugal, I don't know about Spain, but in Portugal they are considered an ethnic and not a national minority. And this is important because the Roma were always in the middle of this imaginary of who belongs in the nation and who belongs in the colony. You could be deported to the colonies for being a Roma, for dressing like a Roma, for living with more than 3 or 4 Roma people in the same street. So the surveillance of the Roma population historically tied also to the colonial history. So you see here. So in regards to your question, I think one thing, I mean, there are many things Portugal and Spain have in common, of course. I mean, the question of the persecution of Jews and Muslim people, it's very telling, the kind of the colonial. I mean, we kind of had the same stages in our history, so to speak, in terms of the conquest of America. Of course, in Portugal, we like to say that the Spanish were violent, not the Portuguese. We always use the Spanish as the example in the Iberian Peninsula to say, well, they went to America and they decimated the indigenous population, not us. So there's always, again, the politics of comparison within the Iberian Peninsula. But another thing at theoretical level that I think it's relevant is that I see that both Portugal and Spain were a bit late in the beginning of discussing post-colonial approaches. So this is something that arrives here like in the first, I don't know, between 2000 and 2010, in the middle of that decade, whilst in the UK, for instance, we've been discussing that since the mid-90s, and even France was, you know, a bit earlier on discussing that. I think here in Portugal, you see a lot, and I will address that, a lot of influence of French thought on the way you conceive or actually you silence race. So this will come up in other things, but so I think there are lots of similarities, and then of course lots of variation within Spain, which is, you know, all the regional that Zinio will address. So I mean that would be my take.
Thank you. Senja?
Yes, of course, the Spanish case is, as you all probably know, quite special when it comes to these tensions between the state and specifically in some regions, the political forces who struggle for more regional independence. So talking about an ethnic minority, the fact that that is quite often perceived as quite controversial in a Spanish context is also related, must be seen in this context. Now, what do you define as an ethnic minority? Could, for example, the Catalan or the Basque people be considered an ethnic minority in relation to the broader Spanish identity or state now, and then what implications would that have, and so on? So there is an avoidance of that concept. And the Roma people, for instance, you could say that they are de facto and national ethnic minority, but they're not recognized as such. There is no recognition of any ethnic minority status or no form of ethnic registration in any way, in Spain. So, which is also often a difficulty for researchers, and which is the target also for several claims-making actors who demand some kind of registration that would make it easier to also to study discrimination, for example. But this is it's a contentious topic in Spain, and that's of course related to this, this relationship between the state level and the regional level.
Thank you. You are already entering into the next question, that is, what data is available, and also what kind of methodologies are usually adopted in documenting racial and ethnic discrimination and so.
You want to go first, Anya? No?
Yeah, should I go first on that? Yeah. I had prepared some more comments also on the theoretical and public debates on race and racism. If that's okay, I just like to briefly mention that. Yeah, because I also think that if you discuss these questions at present in Spain, you also have to include a discussion on the rapid increase in support for the anti-immigrant far right-wing party Vox, which appeared apparently out of nowhere in the elections in 2019 with 15% of the votes, and continues with a strong support. And also now in the recent Catalan elections, almost gained 8%. And we have been also in academia been discussing for long the absence of any salient far-right populist anti-immigrant party in the Spanish context. And now we have to totally change that discussion now, because probably also there was a latent support for long, and there are lots of attempts to analyze this situation. But in any case, so the public debate is really increasingly polarized in this aspect. And this also calls into question several things related to for example, the intercultural policy framework, which is still dominant in Catalonia, especially, and in Barcelona, where I am myself now. And what are the implications for the feasibility also of that intercultural policies in a framework with an increasing support for the extreme right wing. So indeed, there are several tensions here that are very tangible also for us as researchers.
Can I also comment? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
No. I mean, because I also wanted to say something about theoretical and public debates, but if you want to move directly to the related...
No, we can take that. So it's fine. You can also reflect on theoretical and public debates.
I'm not sure now whether Zenia had finished this section or not now.
No, we can have a dialogue like this. I think it's nicer actually.
Yeah, it is. I mean, because it's like I find myself agreeing with a lot of what you're saying. So, I mean, I wanted to mention that even though, there are lots of different understandings of race and racism, a lot of the academic work has actually perpetuated this notion that you should focus on the performance of immigrants and minorities themselves, rather than, the institutional context and policy frameworks. And especially, as Zenia was saying, the question of integration and the question of intercultural dialogue. I think that's another similarity that you see between Portugal and Spain, which is the emphasis on interculturality. So the other thing is that academic training on race and racism has been very marginal in the academia, and it's been concentrated just within a few universities. So, for instance, I've been teaching for many years at PhD level, and I don't teach undergraduates. So it's very apparent that when I have students, and actually most of them are international, so they are not Portuguese, they are students who come just for the PhD, but it's very apparent how students of democracy, they didn't have any contacts whatsoever with the topic of racism before they come. So this is quite apparent, and it was even the case this year, which I thought my job would be easy after Black Lives Matter movement and, all its manifestations across the world. Still, I mean, their unawareness of the debates that are taking place, it's very evident of the situation of discussions on race and racism in academia. And so in the final thing is, of course, the question that the institutional life of universities never gets discussed in these debates about racism in academia. I mean, we can discuss a bit about academic knowledge and so on, but it's also, universities are increasingly international spaces, and we attract increasingly international students who are very often victims of racism. And universities have not developed adequate procedures to deal with this. And so we've had many cases going, public in the last 10 years or so. And I think this is a thing that we should ponder. The good thing is that racism is now, in the last few years, entering the public debate for the worst reasons. We don't have time now, perhaps, to go into this. But still, it's very difficult to address it in its institutionalized forms. So it's difficult to overcome the legacy of an approach to racism that sees it as just, a matter of bias and prejudice, and not related to the unequal distribution of power. So yeah, there are a few steps. We elected the first three with an anti-racist background, three Black members of parliament in 2019. But, it's three in the middle of more than, 100 some. And we elected for the first time a member of the extreme right. So, of course, we are becoming also a more polarized society, as much of Europe in that sense.
Yeah.
Yes, I can add to that, talking about how racism, and anti-racism is approached in Spanish academic debate and research. It's similar. I recognize again much of what Marta said, that it's not very much focused on at all. There is no really salient academic debate on race, racialization, so on. There are some researchers, at least here in Catalonia, who are continuing or beginning to focus on this and to talk more explicitly about racialization, but still research on immigration and diversity is generally more focused on, as Marta also said, on how immigrants perform, equality, inequality, integration, etc. So that would be the more general framework.
I was thinking, I know from the Spanish case, but also from a number of Latin American cases, the concept of Dia de la Raza, the race day, commemorating Columbus, really, and the colonization. To what extent is that present, and to what extent is the avoidance of using race articulated in a progressive way of not reminding of the Dia de la Raza, or to what extent is it used as a way of taking away visibility on racism and so on in Portugal and Spain?
Should I go first? That's okay? Or, yeah. Okay, Dia de la Raza, it's not really a concept in Spain, but it's the Dia de la Hispanidad. No, it's the Spanish National Day on 12th of October, which is a very polemic issue in Catalonia. Lots of institutions here, for example, they actively pronounce themselves against the celebration of that day. There are also mobilizations against the fact that this is a public holiday and so on. So it's definitely not a strong support for this festivity in the Catalan context, which is very different compared to other parts of Spain than Madrid, for instance, where this is indeed celebrated. But I would perhaps not place race so much in relation to that. I think that it is indeed behind this discourse that is predominant now in Spanish policies and documents and texts on anti-discrimination. So on the avoidance of using race, this is indeed justified by the fact that talking about race would just lead to more stigmatization and racialization, if you like. But now those who are defending the use of the term race are mostly pronounced anti-racist scholars and specifically activists. Now, for example, the emerging and quite visible Black African activists that are much more present now than there were a few years ago now, and they are very explicit about this. We need to talk about race. So those who defend the use of race are mainly people who are themselves racialized, who are concerned with the racialization.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me take on that. I mean, Portugal also had the Day of Race, which was the 10th of June, and which is now called Day of Portugal and the Lusophone communities. So it's been kind of depoliticized to mean the same thing, which means Portugal as a former empire in relation to its former colonies. And it was actually interesting because, I don't know, about 20 years ago, a former president had a slippage. And instead of calling it Day of Portugal, he called it Day of Race. And of course, it stirred a kind of public debate because what is encapsulated in this is this kind of national imaginary that the Portuguese are a unique race. And, you know, they are better than the British and the others because they can mingle with the people. But of course, they are above the uncivilized Africans and indigenous in Brazil. So, of course, these kind of imaginaries are always there. And they always tie, you know, to the core notions of the nation and who belongs naturally or not in the nation. They are present in relation to, for instance, the question of citizenship laws. We had just recently, I mean, a great achievement for the anti-racist movement that they have been struggling for recognition of the entitlement to Portuguese citizenship of people being born in Portugal, so the jus solis principle, which was overturned. So we had the jus solis principle until 1981, but when people started coming from the former colonies to Portugal, and most of them stopped being white, so a lot of black people started coming, the law changed strategically to a jus sanguinis principle. So we had, since 2006, we had some changes to that law, but still it privileged the principle of, you know, being born in Portuguese soil by Portuguese parents. So if someone, you know, was born in England speaking English and another language and not even understanding Portuguese, but he was the son of Portuguese people, he automatically could ask for Portuguese citizenship. But if you are born of African people and perhaps you are not legally documented for 5 years in a row, not just 5 years, but 5 years in a row, and you are talking about the context of the crisis, for instance, 2009, 2012, a lot of these people were not. So there were children that were, they were 18, 19, 20, and they did not have Portuguese citizenship. So very recently, there have been many campaigns by anti-racist organizations, and we managed to have a kind of a more fair framework, legal framework, but that still says a lot about, you know, we give a lot of rights to the third and fourth generation of Portuguese, but when it's, you know, to the descendants of other people that, you know, were actually born and raised here and know no other country, that is a different story. So yeah, I mean, of course, race is always in these discussions.
If we go on to the third question I sent out to you around the data available and how we talk about the data and the methodologies in studying race, racism, anti-racism, and so on, what would be the particularities of Portugal and Spain there?
Do you want me to start? Yeah. Well, data on, I was asked specifically to look for data on racial and ethnic discriminations. I focused on that more than the study of race at a broader level, which also is not really such a very developed field of research in Spain yet. No, it's an emergent field, I would say. But the data on discrimination is produced within different spheres, no, sociology and social psychology specifically. And they tend to focus generally on perceptions on discrimination, self-perceived discrimination. So it's a focus, I'd say, on the victims rather than the perpetrators, if you like, of discrimination. Now, there's not so much emphasis or very little, if anything at all, on discriminatory structures, for instance, or on discriminatory practices. There was a recent study just now published by the foundation La Caixa, which was part of a greater European study organized by Switzerland, European comparison on how football clubs discriminated applicants. There were then a large number of fake applications in which one part was phrased as with national sounding names, typically Spanish names in this case. One were British sounding names, and the third category was Arabic sounding names. Now, when they found that the rates of discrimination, which meant the direct reaction of applications by fictitious and football players with Arabic names, was actually more salient in the Spanish case than in the European average. But this was the first study that I have come across really that focused on discriminatory practices and not on the perception and the experience of discrimination. So this is a field that needs to be further developed. I'd say. And yeah, I don't know if it's the same in Portugal, Marta.
Yeah, yes, I can really recognize the same. I mean, there's been a variety of studies, both kind of quantitative surveys, like, the European social surveys that focus on perceptions of racism, on, biased social representations and so on. And there have been also some qualitative methodologies focusing on public institutions. I've been part of a larger European project in which we were studying, how kind of integration and interculturality frameworks perpetuate race and racism. So it's varied studies, but they're very small scale, generally, except the European social surveys, which receive a lot of funding and so on. But so you'll have a lot of PhD students doing work on this, increasingly also looking at historical dimensions of racism. And then there are, some kind of studies that are national in focus and not so wider in terms of considering, not just experiences of racism, but also how institutional frameworks and procedures perpetuate racism. So actually, because there's an understanding that we'll discuss next about what can be collected as data, such data has been always collected by proxies. And so it's like immigration status, country of origin, parents' nationality, and so on. So we cannot collect data on race as such. Of course, we can if you comply with the ethical guidelines enshrined in the national legislation for data protection. So, but the public argument, it has been always that, we have a constitution that ended political persecution in 1976. And so from now on, we cannot collect sensitive data, but the constitution itself is ensures that nobody is discriminated. So we have formal equality. So why are you complaining of racism? Our law is an example to a lot of European nations. So this kind of political discourse is repeated all the time. So the kind of question of the public reluctance in collecting data is also tied to this notion that, it's like the legacy of French thought in Portuguese intellectuals, that we have to be anti-differentialist, we have to be universalist, and until 2-3 years, this was the official policy of the Portuguese state. We don't have policies for specific groups. We don't discriminate anyone. We treat everyone the same. Of course, we know history has shown that doesn't work, and things are changing. In terms of specific data regarding racial discrimination, there is some data, but that is completely unreliable, which is the complaints collected by the CICDR, it's the Commission for Equality and Against Discrimination, racial discrimination. But this is totally the tip of the iceberg. So first, there's a total distrust of institutions, and people know that the system just doesn't work. I mean, I myself have tried to make a few complaints of content that was sent to me and, stuff like that. And sometimes it takes years and you never get an answer. That's, for starters. Then there's a lack of formal denunciations. I mean, I think now we're starting to have a culture of increasing denunciations, but people, because they don't trust the system, they don't even know sometimes the channels, they don't. And then, of course, there is, and we then work a bit on that, there is the people who receive the complaints and decide whether, this has the requirements to go ahead as a formal complaint or not. So there are institutional mechanisms that filter denunciations, and it means that we just have like a handful of convictions in Portugal about the question of racism. If you want to discuss it further afterwards, and we have time, I mean, we had a working group for the census of which I took part to include the question of ethnic and racial origin in the 2021 census. It was a very illustrative example, but because it will take me 5 minutes, I won't go there. But just to say that even though this commission, after 1 year, decided 9 votes in favor and 4 against, that yes, and there are lots of members from racialized communities within the working group, processes of consultation, focus groups, surveys to people. I mean, a lot of public discussion. It was decided, yes, we would include the question, and then the National Council of Statistics refused to do so. And so, I mean, we knew we're dealing with a lot of institutional blockages, but that goes to say again how difficult it is to collect this data, even though everyone knows, and now we are in a different group for the national plans against racism. And now the authorities acknowledge publicly, yes, that we collect data in the police, in schools, in hospitals, in maternities, everywhere. So we know that this is going on for 20 or 30 years. It's just that, so information is collected unofficially and it's not published. So it's not related to mechanisms of public accountability, for instance.
Okay. Yeah. If we proceed a little bit, we'll come back to the university shortly, but what is the situation of mobilizations against racism and discrimination in Portugal and Spain? I was saying the reason we started this was, in a sense, taking the cue from the mobilization linked to Black Lives Matter and so on. And to what extent did that show up in Portugal and Spain, and to what extent is it linked to other forms of social protest against racism and other forms of ethnic racial discrimination?
Should I go first? Yeah. In Spain, there is a lot going on in this field, and there is much activism in the field of anti-racism or immigrants' rights from different perspectives. And what was my impression of the Black Lives Matter, which I have also very much discussed lately with several people that I know in this movement, in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the Afro Spanish rights movements that are emerging and are gaining much presence and visibility lately now, is that the murder of George Floyd and the surge of the international Black Lives Matter movement, it clearly fueled movements by Black people across Spain that had been taking form for several years, but that sort of needed a fuse, to become really visible and present. And that has happened since, and that is still very much going on in this field. Black activists that highlighted the racism that Black people face in Spain. And I'd say that these movements have been perhaps particularly active in Catalonia, which is often the case also for activism in general. This is a very activist part of the country. Now there's a lot of going on here, and it's very active third sector. So the anti-racist movement in Spain, I also need to say that it's very diverse. It's not only about Black activism, obviously, but instead the anti-racist movement covers a very broad patchwork of movements of different ethnicities, different areas. For example, it could also include movements for resident permits for undocumented migrants, movements against Islamophobia, anti-Gypsism, against precariousness of immigrants, which is very widespread and which is a very big issue, really, at present, aggravated by the pandemic, obviously. And there are movements against migrant detention centers, against stigmatization and violence affecting unaccompanied minors, which is also a very salient topic present in right-wing populist discourses against immigration and in the media. This concern of a number of young Moroccan, mainly men, who migrate alone and then who are often linked discursively to an increase in street violence, robberies, etc. So there are also movements defending all these different groups of immigrants, and these movements are often broader than just one issue of racism. It's about migrants' rights at a more general level. So.
Yeah.
Before I let in you, Marta, one thing I was anti-Gypsism, is that also taken up by anti-racist movements?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Increasingly, also in the last years, that I myself also have been engaged in this issue in a few projects for the last years, and I've really seen how this the focus on anti-Gypsism as a problem has been taken up also by more general anti-racist organizations, and also about public authorities. For instance, at the level of the city council in Barcelona, since 2018, they also made anti-Gypsism a priority area for anti-racist and interculturalist work in Barcelona.
Thank you. So, Marta?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was one of the issues I wanted to comment on. So I think really what's kind of new about the protests that took place, I mean, in Portugal, we saw massive protests in support of Black Lives Matter. And I think what's kind of new is the massive wide support to demonstrations led by Black people. So this was a difference, okay? I'll go back to a point in time before this, but I think this was a massive difference. And the other thing is what Sani called, it's precisely these alliances, these broader alliances that were very visible, for instance, in demonstrations here in Coimbra and in Lisbon. I mean, the Roma people supporting the struggles of Black people. And so as a joint struggle against racism, against structural and historical racism. So I think the kind of issues that became more apparent during the 2020 mobilization were these. The thing is that mobilization, of course, did not start now. I think increasingly people are looking at the long history of mobilization against racism. So if, I don't know, 10 years ago, we were looking a lot at the intellectual thought of national liberation struggles in Africa, people now are, for instance, tracing the emergence of kind of Pan-Africanist movements in Portugal in the early 20th century. And so they are kind of tracking the emergence of almost like a black press, the emergence of intellectual mobilization across the 20th century in contexts like the Portuguese, in which, you know, nothing was done. So this is really like archival work that people are doing now, because this was, of course, a silenced issue in academia for so long. So there are these two issues. But I wanted to say that in terms of mobilization, actually, I think one in the last, I mean, in the period that I remember more closely, I mean, since we had the murder in the mid-90s of Alcindo Monteiro, which generated a lot of mobilization, and he was killed by the extreme right in Portugal. And this is never mentioned, you know, as if Portugal never had extreme right. Well, there were not established political parties until recently, but of course there were extreme right political grouplets and, you know, kind of skinhead movements and so on. And so then another moment was in 2015, in which there was a very unfortunately famous case of police brutality against 6 Black youth in Lisbon, some of them who were known activists. And so this caused a lot of public outrage and a lot of media coverage for the first time. So this was 2015. And since then, there was a massive articulation of anti-racist struggles, not just within specific collectives and movements, but across a broad range of localities. And so, for instance, in Lisbon, you saw in 2016, there were 22 collectives who signed a letter to the United Nations, to the Commission for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, denouncing the situation on racism in Portugal, and also the institutional denial of racism. So I think, you know, for us, 2015 and 16, they were a breaking point. They were a breaking point after which you could no longer deny that there was racism in Portuguese society. Of course, you know, you always have negationists everywhere. But, you know, the terms of the debate change. You start seeing a lot of Black intellectuals in the press, in politics, becoming a bit more visible in academia, very small numbers, of course. And so the terms of the debate were changing. I think the moment of Black Lives Matter allowed that to come to the public who wasn't watching. But just because they weren't watching, it doesn't mean it wasn't there. So I think we have to, you know, have these two tensions. Yes, there was something new coming out of that, but it was there already and quite firmly being established.
Thank you. In 10 minutes, about 10 minutes, we'll stop this discussion and open up for questions and so on. But we have two last questions, and I thought if you could take them because they are partially related. On the one hand, there's to what talking about these mobilizations, to what extent do you see them as changing something? And secondly, linking that to what is the role of academia in understanding racism and in understanding anti-racism, and what role do we as researchers play in this?
Yes, I think that these moments, they reflect something that is and there is really much frustration among the second generation, specifically in Spain, young people, young racialized people, young Black people, Muslim people, Roma people, etc. who are not going to accept to be in subordinate positions. Now, as for example, immigration to Spain has been very much linked to a labor market segmentation in which a large share of all the immigrants came here now to occupy more precarious positions in certain sectors of the economy, but their children who are born here, they are not accepting to be in such subordinate positions. Now, when there is this increasing mobilization also, and at least even if it's a slow change, you can see that there are more students now at the university who have a diverse background. There is an emerging presence perhaps, but it's still too early to see where this is going. Still, there is an enormous underrepresentation, for example, at the institutional level of people of diverse origins. In this context, as an indication of a possible change here, I can just mention in the current call for applications to the Barcelona Police Force Academy, they have phrased it as a specific merit to have knowledge of Urdu, Chinese, or Arabic languages. And you could interpret that as a way to go around the very controversial topic of quotas or positive action, for example, no, but to try to emphasize specific immigrant-related skills, no, as a way to try to diversify a little bit the police force, no, because this is also a matter for debate, but in politics, in the education system, in the police force, etc., there is almost no representation of the diversity of the population at all. No? So this is one issue that is under debate, that is subject to mobilization, and then we can see some potential for change here. How could the research community contribute to change? I think it's important there also to recognize and to dare talk about this also internally at our departments and institutions, now that it is still a contentious topic often to talk about race, racialization in academia. I often encounter that the use of racialization is, for example, not at all mainstreamed, it's questioned. And even also when I have approached occasionally researchers to talk to discuss collaborations around the research on discrimination, for example, this is also not taken for granted that discrimination really exists as a problem that affects people of certain characteristics, not as immigrants. But I would also encounter reactions saying that, well, okay, but then you need to talk about how natives are discriminated and immigrants are privileged now in different contexts. So there is no general consensus about this, I would say, in academia. And I think one way in which we can contribute to this development or this ourselves is, for example, by avoiding to reproduce racial stereotypes in our own work, which may seem very obvious. But for instance, I reviewed an article recently that, in a way, even though it was clearly unintentional, reproduced quite stereotypical ideas of Roma culture, for example. Now, so be very cautious about how we describe different groups of others in our own research. That's one way. And not to be afraid to be critical without, of course, compromising the academic rigor. But we need to dare also to be critical and sometimes normative in our research about these topics, I think. I think I will end for now and pass the word to Marta.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a kind of commonplace, for people who work on critical race theories to say, well, we have some optimism, but. So we always, we look at history and we know that history shows time and time again that there are reasons to be cautious and, to look forward for, possible change, to see signs of hope, but of course, always remaining critical and cautious. One thing that struck me was that initial discomfort that was provoked by watching the images of George Floyd dying was very quickly replaced by the discomfort of those who saw the statues being vandalized as, the killing of national symbols. So I think, of course, we've seen again and again how debates get displaced and get depoliticized and get contained, that the potential for change is contained. And in Portugal, there was, the question of, how we deem as ignorant those defacing the statues, in terms of, you know, the involvement of the clergy, the Portuguese clergy in enslavement. And actually we had our President of the Republic saying, you know, people doing these kind of things are totally ignorant. But of course, what he didn't know is that they were more knowledgeable, and they were quite aware of all the writings that, you know, this priest had published that led them to say decolonize in the statue that they graffitied. So, you know, questions of knowledge and ignorance are always at play here. And of course, they are articulated and they are intersected with power. So a good example, or something that is a bit more optimistic, is, of course, we know, you know, this kind of formal intentions only go this far, but the European Union coming with the compulsory nature of these national plans against racism, well, at least it's a sign that the denial of racism is not in the mainstream. Okay, of course we can deny the effects of racism in terms of structure, in terms of, you know, discrimination and so on, but this is a step to acknowledging there is an issue here that needs to be addressed. In Portugal, we are working hard to put a lot of proposals in a number of areas. It's a kind of very ambitious project. It's not yet been presented to the public. It's going to be presented in 2 days' time. And of course, the public reaction to this will tell everything about the ongoing fracture that exists in Portuguese society in regards to this struggle. In terms of academia, well, I think just kind of summing the issues that Xenia brought up. I mean, yes, of course, we need to consider our conceptual approaches, like she was saying in regards to this article. A lot of times our conceptual approaches perpetuate the stereotypes that we want to criticize, even if we are very well-meaning academics. So we have to go beyond discussing racism as a problem of poorly intentioned people, the problem of, you know, the usual bad apples and so on. And so we need to rethink our research focus and methodologies. I mean, all this focus on the extreme right, yes, it is useful, yes, it is needed, but if that is always our focus when we discuss racism, well, racism in institutions just goes unchallenged. So we need to be aware of what is our individual contribution to challenge the agenda. Then in terms of pedagogical practices, I mean, I told you with our students, it's like, it is difficult sometimes for them. Now it's getting better, but like when you include the text by Black intellectuals, they tend to be seen as kind of suspicious. It's not so evident nowadays, but, you know, only 5-6 years ago, this was quite evident. So the kind of, you know, how you choose the canon of knowledge, how you teach, you know, all of these are important issues that we have to consider. And then finally is like, we have to be willing to intervene in public. And this is not something that I particularly like. And dialoguing with policymakers, it's not my cup of tea, let's say. But yes, we have to demand public accountability, especially in this time that we are, you know, increasingly resorting to the idea of evidence-based policy, which, you know, it has a long history of decades, but, you know, nowadays it seems to be very fashionable again. So we need to hold those in positions of power and decision-making accountable, and to consider our own privilege. I mean, a white man denouncing racism in a specific debate or in a specific event or monument or discussion, it's not the same as a Black intellectual or a Black anti-racist doing it. And we have very sad examples lately of people whose life is being threatened, who have police, who have to resort to police escorting and so on. And this is happening not just in Portugal, but across Europe. We have seen evidence of what is called sometimes scholars of color, for instance, in the UK, being persecuted for challenging figures such as Winston Churchill and so on. So we are seeing that we are at a time in which the combat of racism is difficult within academic circles and political circles, and we should not forget our privilege as white academics in that struggle, and to acknowledge that generally we don't suffer the same kind of consequences that suffer Black people or Roma people. I'm not even mentioning Roma people in academia, because still the level of marginalization is such that we don't have a significant presence of Roma people in academia, but the way is being paved up. I mean, there's an association who managed to have a very small scale program of affirmative action that is now has over 40 Roma students in higher education. So you see the level of discrimination that exists.
Thank you, and thank you for fantastic reflections and information about the situation in Portugal and Spain. We've received a couple of questions. One is Marta. Thank you for your powerful presentation. As we don't have many voices denouncing racism in Portugal, especially its invisibility in the Portuguese academia. I was wondering if you could make any comments on the impact of COVID-19 and the rise of the far right, now the three political power in Portugal, in boosting racism in the country.
Shall I reply directly? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on research on COVID-19 and its racialized impact, but I think, of course, we see the news and we pay attention to race issues. And of course, I have people that work on activism and that discuss this with me. And so, I mean, telling things was the privilege of white people to be at home in confinement, which was a privilege that many communities in Lisbon did not have. So, for instance, whilst the news were initially reporting on deserted cities like Lisbon at, I don't know, 9 a.m. in the morning, what they were not showing was the overcrowded trains at 6:30 in the morning of Black people going to clean the offices in Lisbon, or Black people going to clean people's houses, or doing all kind of, you know, this kind of services in the city of Lisbon. So, I mean, there was the entitlement to confinement, you know, that's something that's very racialized. Again, situations of precarity in employment always affect more racialized people. So we don't have, you know, specific statistics, and that's, you know, our struggle for data is that in crisis situations such as these, or as in the economic crisis earlier on, it's easy to have access to data and to show how this is affecting different populations in Portugal. Again, I mean, we have situations, for instance, of how the extreme right turned against the Roma communities, and initially, in the first few months, the level of racism directed at Roma communities as if they were, again, you know, these notions of Europe that are behind, as if they were polluted already, as if they were uncompliant and uncivilized, and therefore they are the evil that is going to propagate the virus. I mean, this is very strong indeed, and this to select just a few issues. And in regards to the far right, I mean, yes, of course, we do have to comment on the ascent of the far right, but I think it's also important that we have a very serious study of how certain topics have been taken by the far right that actually reflect the consensus on the center. So I did, like in around 2010, we were doing research on mainstream political and academic discourse on racism. And so this is people who travel between academia and the world of politics. And they would be mostly from the Socialist Party and Social Democrats. And when you analyze, for instance, the major conferences that were organized in that decade on racism and immigration, I mean, it is very clear that the same themes that the extreme right picks up, they are there. This idea that we cannot allow veiled women to come to Portugal because, you know, that's an affront to our civilization. The idea that the number of immigrants has to be controlled, which is an idea that is controversial. I mean, we've had debates in Britain, for instance, in the 1950s about the self-regulation of immigrant trajectories when, you know, it's not so easy to go to a country and get a job and establish there. So it's like, these are controversial issues that have been kind of mainstreamed by the political parties in the center of the spectrum, and then of course they are taken up by the extreme right in a more sensationalist fashion. I mean, even in regards to Islamophobia, we could see the same kind of thing. So for instance, in the work that I was involved on Islamophobia, actually we're trying to map the 10 most common Islamophobic narratives in Portugal in the public debate, and only one I mapped was directly connected to the extreme right, which is like they are invading us. And this is a kind of a explanatory argument that is not developed any further, because I mean the extreme right capacity of having a really solid sustained argument has been actually very poor in Portugal. So when you see all the other Islamophobic arguments, they are coming from the mainstream. So it's like, yes, we should be worried that we have the extreme right. I think, yes, we should have evaluated from the first start how we always said that our constitution protected us against such groups. And now we actually allow them to take power. But yes, I don't think the problem of racism is the problem of the extreme right.
Thank you, Marta. I thought putting this question also to you, Senia, because two things I was reflecting. One was the recent election in Catalonia with Vox, and the second was COVID-19, especially knowing that Catalonia has a large population of Chinese migrants, one of the biggest groups of migrants. To what extent has this merged into racism in Spain, in Catalonia?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you for that, Anders. I would just like to say first that I very much agree with what Marta is saying here, that we talk a lot about right-wing extremism and populist parties. Of course, I agree very much with the fact that institutional or structural racism, it's everywhere and it's much broader. And if we focus too much on the extreme right, perhaps we fail to see how racism is really inherent in lots of practices that we are used to and consider normal, in mainstream institutions and so. Regarding your questions of the impact of the COVID, actually, which is both worrying and rather interesting, the impact has not been very salient at all on, for example, racist speech affecting the Chinese community. There is a big Chinese community indeed, but instead what we have seen and what we are working with right now in relation to this project on anti-Gypsism that I am managing right now is that there has been indeed a very tangible increase in anti-Gypsies discourse related to COVID, and in which Roma people are accused of spreading the disease because they are framed as living in overcrowded apartments. They're out in the streets selling their goods, etc. They are the people, one of the groups who have had more difficulties in complying with the confinement. At least that's the popular idea of the way things are. It is true that they have been very severely economically damaged by the effects of the pandemic and the confinement policies now. And this is used then in racist discourses in social media, etc. Also, occasionally in general media, there's been some framing of Roma people and also to some extent more marginalized and vulnerable immigrant groups who are more or less living in homelessness, for example, and cannot actually be confined anywhere now, and accusing them of spreading the virus. So it hasn't been so much related to the fact that this virus originated in China, no? But more to the situations in which people live. And there has also been a lot of debate and critical debates about how unequal the effects of this pandemic are, no? In terms of being able or not to work from home, to be confined or not. No? So, but that's what we have seen more of in relation to racism. And sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, there was another part of your question as well. Now, can you remind me, please, of what you said in the beginning?
Yeah, it was partially linked to what you said about Vox and the rise of Vox in Spain and now in Catalonia as well. But you almost commented, but I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah. Oh, no, I think I made that very clear. I think it's just important to remember that racism is not limited to Vox. No, it's much broader, of course. Yeah.
Thank you, Thais Franca, for this question. And we had another from Konstantin Manyakin, talking about the center-left government in Denmark purporting policies now to reduce non-Western residents in Denmark. So the question is, do you think, or do you expect similar scenarios in Portugal and Spain?
Well, I can start. I am just speculating then. I mean, we cannot, I think we cannot take for granted that these kind of things couldn't happen here, and of course also then the importance of the right-wing agenda in politics becomes more tangible, maybe than when we talk about racism at a more general level of society. When we look at these kind of measures, political measures that could be, or discourses that could be implemented. For example, right now there is a political battle going on in one region in Spain, that is Murcia, in which what first appeared to be a sort of a socialist takeover of power is changed direction completely into coalitions between the conservative right-wing party and the radical extreme right-wing party now. And what effects that will have in terms of, for example, measures concerning immigration integration policies, that's something that we can just speculate about, but these kind of measures are not on the agenda right now at the general level in Spain. No, it's still a predominantly interculturalist framework here, but we should definitely not take for granted that cannot change.
Thank you. Marta?
Yes. Yeah, Sam, I mean, it's not an issue that is in our agenda. I mean, there's a large pattern of segregation across cities like Lisbon, Porto, or even Coimbra. Especially in Coimbra, it's more in regards to the Roma population. But in Lisbon, I mean, it's a very racialized city. You can see it as you go in the subway, and the areas that become more white and then become darker and so on, and that's very evident. But the thing that has been on the agenda and that is generating quite a lot of research as well is the question of forced evictions. So the question of what we say as self-built neighborhoods. I don't know what's the terminology in English for this. So it's housing that was built by people who came here in the 70s, mostly. For instance, in Lisbon, a lot of them from Cape Verdean origin. They came in different moments to work in Portuguese construction. So in the 70s, then for the Euro and so on, for the Expo 98 that we also had, and people that always had a very low income, and so they built their own houses, and now they are in spaces of the city that didn't have a lot of commercial value 40 years ago, but now they do. So what is happening is that a lot of these families are being evicted without alternatives being provided. And so in the last, I don't know, at least 10 years, this has been very high on the anti-racist agenda, and a lot of colleagues working on urban issues and so on have been addressing this kind of situations.
Thank you. There was you mentioned in your talk that you didn't have time to talk so much about Tropicalism, but there's a question now on that. What does it mean and how it hinders the recognition of structural racism today? And how is this ideal different or somewhat similar to other nationalist ideals present in other European countries?
Thank you. So yeah, I'll start by saying that each nation has its own national narratives about tolerance, okay? So you see that across Europe, you see that in the States, in Brazil, whether it's color blindness, whether it's racial democracy, whether it's fairness. I mean, each country, whether it's republicanism, each country has a narrative that enables them to say that historically they have not favored racism to flourish, okay? So Lusotropicalism is just, the Portuguese specific version of that. Lusotropicalism was a kind of theory, a theoretical project by anthropologist Gilberto Freire, Brazilian social scientist. And he theorized that since the 1930s to say that the Portuguese, because they were a mix of people themselves from Moorish, Celts and others, and they had to deal with Jewish people, with Moorish people in the Iberian Peninsula throughout the centuries, they had acquired a greater capability to deal with people from other world regions. And it was meaning to say that, the success of Brazilian racial democracy, and I'm putting a lot of quotes on this. So his idea was that we were better colonizers, that we mixed with native women, not considering the context in which such sexual relations took place of white men with indigenous or black women, very often forced. And so this was never recognized. And so this was, kind of theory that Gilberto Freire was creating. In the 1930s in Portugal, this idea was very poorly received in Portugal. Basically, it played against fears of racial degeneration. So the fear was, if we recognize that we as a people, we are not racially pure, we are the mix of all these people, of all these historical processes, then it means we are not quite white. And you have to understand that Portugal was never always considered white. I mean, when I go to, to Sweden or Finland, especially to Sweden, I'm always reminded of that. We don't consider you quite white. So it's like throughout history, in the late 19th century and so on, there were these debates that, Africa started in the Pyrenees. So below of the Pyrenees, everything was already Africa. So the Portuguese always have to defend their position within Europe. So they have always to reinforce that we are part of Europe. We are geographically positioned in Europe. And so this is something that has been to be performed constantly. So at the time, the theory didn't get accepted in Portugal. But in the context of international nations' criticism of Portugal colonialism, that, Britain was starting to decolonize and so on, Salazar started using partially this idea. So he invited Gilberto Freire to come to Portugal, and he endorsed the idea that the Portuguese were prone and very good at culturally integrating with other people, culturally, the word is missing, but so having cultural relations with other people, but the question of biological miscegenation was dropped. So there was no conversation about the biological part. So it was a way of saving our face as European whites, but still saying that we have the national advantage to deal with other peoples. Of course, this discourse was deployed in the context of saying we don't have colonies, we have overseas provinces. And so this was when the United Nations were accusing Portugal that we did not decolonize. And we used this argument to say that we don't colonize. Portugal is a multi-continental, multiracial country, from Minho in the north of Portugal to East Timor in the other part of the world. So this, what can be perceived as a kind of theory, is really a solid theoretical field, or a kind of a discursive field that has influenced until today the policies, our self-perceptions, the ideas about national identity of who we are. It's like all discussions will start, yes, but our colonialism was better than anyone else's. I mean, it's like, even in textbooks, you always, and I've done a lot of research on history textbooks, and so this idea that you never discuss racism or violence in relation to Portuguese colonialism. It's only the Dutch that were violent, the Spanish that were violent, the British or the French that were racist. So you see how in 2021, after, we ended the dictatorship and colonialism in 1975, it's like we still very much as a people have this kind of notions. Sorry if I took too long.
Thank you. But how would we translate? Is there an alternative of different version of Tropicalism in Spain? We talked about Dia de la Raza that started in the beginning of the 20th century and then was converted with other names to Hispanidad finally. And that is celebrated with the king in Spain still. It was, when you go to the end of the La Rambla in Barcelona, then you find the big statue of Columbus. How would you characterize the Spanish national version of fantasticness and nationalism?
Yeah. This is still, for example, very tangible in the history education. I noticed that also through a recent project in which I looked at how colonialism is described in history books in schools, in Catalonia in this case. It's a very neutral approach. No, it's definitely not critical, nor generally to, for example, talking about genocides or oppression or negative consequences in general of colonialism. But also, I have to say that I, as having been present in Catalonia for the past 20 years, I'm clearly biased. I'm very influenced by the general debates here on Spanish colonialism, which are often very critical. So it's it's not the same as if you would have been in Madrid and be exposed to, for example, the debate climate there, which is surely very different. So I must say that I have a difficulty, and I have been thinking a lot about this lately. I have a difficulty in defining a general Spanish discourse on colonialism. Now, this is very, very much contested within Spain. There's lots of voices, both institutional and for example, among the social organizations here, even demanding to take down the statue of Christopher Columbus on Las Ramblas and to ban entirely the celebration of this Spanishness Day on the 12th of October. No? And there are lots of spokespersons for a much more critical discourse on colonialism, also in general in school material, etc. But then there is also this other side. The Spanish state, I think I perceive it as quite, now especially with the socialist regime, is quite neutral in this matter. No, it's not a very salient topic, but it is among academics, political actors, institutional actors, social organizations, etc. It's a contested topic. There is no general consensus. No, I don't recognize anything similar to the Luso-Tropicalism that Marta described in the Spanish context.
A final question, since no one else, I take the privilege as a moderator to put all my questions. You have very little mentioned the church and Catholicism. And I was thinking, because when I start out talking about these things, and also recognizing what Marta said about not having this strong division between cultural racism and biological racism, or we could also talk about a religion's role in this. I start out with the classic debate in Valladolid between Sepúlveda and Bartolomé de las Casas. And I was thinking, to what extent about what is the indigenous human being? Is it a human being, and so on? And then the later discussion, to what extent, because in that debate, Bartolomé de las Casas was seen as anti-racist, but later on he, by the way, said that we can take people from Africa instead, and that has also been very much discussed, to what extent he was in favor of African slavery and so on. But to what extent both Portugal and you could also link, at least from knowing a little bit about Spanish history, the extreme right, both in the previous versions and in Vox today, to the Catholic Church. To what extent does that intersect with racism?
Yeah, yes, of course, very much. It's very, very relevant now. Those looking at the Francoist dictatorship and further back. In the beginning of the speech, when I talked about the treatment of the Roma population in Spain, that could be also more explicitly linked to the Catholic Church. So that was at a time of the strong rule by the so-called Catholic kings, in the 15th century. And there was no tolerance at that time for other religious minorities. There was oppression, and the strong version of Catholicism, or the Catholic Church, has indeed been linked to right-wing discourse in Spain throughout, and still is very much present in, for example, in the discourse of Vox. So, but would you like to specify perhaps more, if you had a more specific question about this?
No, I was thinking to what extent the church is an actor, because in certain ways, churches sometimes have been quite progressive in anti-racism, in migration, and sometimes they've been quite reactionary in that. And if you have any reflections in relation to Spain and Portugal on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would not make any statement of the church being an actor that contributes as an institution to fuel racist discourses, for example, because I don't quite think that's the case. It's more that Catholicism is used as an argument by right-wing actors, The church is as so many other institutions, organizations, also very divided and very diverse. Now, within the very broad institution of the Catholic Church in Spain, there are so many different formations, from the more progressive kind of left-wing priests who talk about poverty and justice and things, and up to the elite layers of this fraternity Opus Dei, for example, who controls some parts perhaps of power institutions in Spain. So it's a very, very broad institutions with different currents in this field. I think it's more a question of how Catholic religion is linked to Spanishness and used as an argument against those who are otherized in relation to this by some actors, for example, as representatives of this party Vox.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there is really the need for research on this, actually. So it's very clear that, for instance, the question of interculturality and the official endorsement of interculturality and all its institutions. So we had these High Commissioners for Migration, Intercultural Dialogue, and Ethnic Minorities. The name changed over 20 years. It changed many times. But it's very telling that almost all, perhaps except the last one, High Commissioner, they were all Jesuits, or they have connections to the church. And so I think this is an area that, nobody ever looked very carefully at that, but you can see here a certain narrative being espoused by what could be seen as progressive sectors of the church. I wanted to share an image, which I'm going to do it through the chat. Through the chat, which is from the monument I alluded to that was vandalized. And it ties to your question, Anders. So in Portugal, we have an equivalent to Bartolomeu de las Casas, okay? And our equivalent is precisely Padre António Vieira, the man whose statue, I don't know if you can see the image in the messages, because I cannot share the screen, so I just send the image, a link to the image. And in the image, what you can see is precisely this statue. Pay attention that it was inaugurated only in 2017. So this is not an old statue. This was in 2017, the same year that Lisbon approved in the Participatory Budget Council a monument to the victims of enslavement, which will be the first ever memorial to the victims of enslavement in Portugal. So the same year you are approving you are erecting this statue. And the statue represents Father António Vieira with 3 indigenous children, which has been thoroughly criticized everywhere for this infantilization of indigenous people, as you can see here. And it has been graffitied with the word decolonize. Padre António Vieira, for instance, in history textbooks, is depicted in similar ways to Bartolomeu de las Casas by saying that, he struggled for the rights of indigenous populations, and he was in favor of the abolition of slavery. Of course, what is not said, and what 95% of the population does not know, is that he also wrote, he's very famous for his writings, for his oratory, and so his speeches. So in one of his speeches, the words are mixing the languages, sorry. He actually tolerates the enslavement of African people, as a way of civilizing them, whilst he, tries to save indigenous people from enslavement. So this story around Padre António Vieira only became known because of activists and intellectuals who have been, studying these figures more thoroughly, because actually, this is not the versions we learn in history or even in universities. Vieira is considered a pioneer of globalization for the modernized world. There are books published on this, like the pioneer of globalization. So you can see here how certain narratives within sectors of the Catholic Church are very intertwined with the interculturality industry, if we can say that, and with narratives on race, and of course, on the absence of racism. so to say, we always had our heroes who struggled against injustice and oppression. So, yeah, thank you. That was a very crucial thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Sinja, and thank you, Marta, for I've learned a lot. I like this is the third seminar. I've learned, I mean, I'm still very focused in my research on what happens in Sweden, and getting these seminars together to get a picture of the discussions, the perspectives in other countries, and how similar topics are treated differently, how different histories and contexts affect how they are treated, and so on. You've been fantastic. I've learned a lot. I hope you participating has also enjoyed it and learned a lot. And I want to make information that we will have a fourth version later on this semester, and it will be on Germany and France. And of course, this is within IMISCO, so I wouldn't do my stuff correctly. That help us in making IMISCO even better in issues concerning studying inequality through race, migration, racism, and so thank you very much, and especially thank you, Sinja and Marta, for your fantastic contributions.
Thank you very much for this initiative. It's been very, very stimulating, great questions and great debate also, and learned a lot from Marta as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the conversation was really nice, and we really look forward to IMISCO's next steps on the question of race and racism. So we hope to hear from you on that.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.